And I know that some sites are having all employee meetings today, so we'll record the session for them so they can review this offline. Just as a follow-up, I try to be pretty diligent about posting all of the recordings on the Teams channel. If you click the link, it probably will send me an approval message that I have to approve, but I get them pretty frequently, so I just go through and get those approved as quickly as I can so that you can view those offline. If somebody is aware of an easier way to do that, please let me know, because I am by no means a Teams expert of any kind. I also have the chat for the session up on my phone here, so I'll try to keep an eye on that in case folks would rather post questions into the chat rather than coming off mute and asking them as we're moving forward. This session may not take as long as some of the previous ones did. Section 6 is not one of the longest sections within the ISO standard, but it's deceptive in how brief the language in the standard is versus how much of an impact it has on our organizations. So I'm going to share my screen here so that you can see the standard, and if somebody can give me a thumbs up or let me know when you can see my screen. Folks, can you see my screen? Sorry, I didn't see it.
Yes, we can see it.
All right, perfect. We'll go ahead and get started then. We are talking about Section 6, which is resource management. And you're going to see, very similar to when we did the training in Section 4 and Section 5, that the standard kind of continues to build upon itself as we march through it. When we talk about resource management, the provision of resources, again, focusing in on the shalls of the ISO standard, the organization shall determine and provide resources that are needed to do two primary things. The first thing is that you are going to have resources to implement a quality management system and maintain its effectiveness. So if you'll recall, when we were going over Section 4, Section 4 describes the construction of the quality management system, and it talks about the need to maintain its effectiveness over time, especially as you make changes to the quality system. You'll recall that conversation from Section 4 training. Section 5 talked about the management commitment to the quality management system and maintaining its effectiveness. So you build it, management commits that they are going to implement and maintain the effectiveness of the quality management system. Well, how does management deliver on that commitment? Well, one of the primary ways that management delivers on that commitment is by providing resources. And those resources will implement the quality system and maintain its effectiveness. That's one of the primary objectives of this resources clause within the regulation. The other one is, in order to meet applicable regulatory and customer requirements. Now that should also sound very familiar to everybody on the call, because if you'll remember when we had our first training on the ISO standard, when you look at Section 1.0, the scope and effectively the purpose of the ISO 13485 standard, it says that you will create a quality management system, and the purpose of that quality management system is to meet applicable regulatory requirements and to meet customer requirements. So again, we're building on the same themes or the same core requirements that originated in Section 1.0 of ISO 13485, and we're kind of marching through and building upon those in every subsequent section. So that is how management commitment is delivered upon, is by the provision of resources. So what are the types of resources that management is required to provide by the standard? Okay, they're required to provide human resources, which we'll talk about. They're required to provide infrastructure, and they're required to provide a work environment and contamination control in order to achieve these objectives, the objectives of having a quality system that maintains its effectiveness and meeting customer and regulatory requirements. We're going to go through each of those in a little bit more detail, as we usually do. So we're going to come down here to Section 6.2 that talks about human resources. So there are a few things that I want to call your attention to in this first sentence, in addition to it containing one of our shalls, right, that we always try and focus in on. It says that this section of the regulation pertains to personnel that are performing work that affects product quality. Now that can be a little bit of an interesting phrase, because different organizations interpret that differently in terms of who falls under the scope of an individual within the organization that could affect product quality. Obviously, the most direct example would be the operators, or the direct labor technical personnel that are actually building the devices in the clean room environments. But I will tell you that in my experience, FDA inspectors, notified body regulators, they take a pretty broad approach to who could affect product quality. And in many cases, if you're operating within the quality management system at all, then you have some effect on product quality, and they consider that you fall under the scope of this regulation. So that's why you see things where in an organization, if you've got a training matrix, you might have people on that training matrix that are only tangentially or on the periphery have any impact on product quality, but we include them just out of a conservative nature to meet this requirement of the regulation. So, broad base of individuals that affect product quality, and they shall be competent on the basis of appropriate education, training, skills, and expertise. So the very next thing that the organization has to do, the next shall, is that you will establish competence, meaning we will ensure and provide evidence that the individuals that could affect product quality are competent specifically for the job that they perform, and that we will provide the necessary training and awareness for those personnel. So that's kind of an important distinction to draw. An individual that affects product quality does not have to have competency in everything. They only have to have competency in the areas for which they are directly responsible. And even in an inspection or in an audit, if the inspector is interviewing operators on the production floor and they are asking questions about a manufacturing process that takes place at another workstation for which that operator does not perform that task, we don't have to be able to demonstrate that operators are equally competent across the entire manufacturing process unless operators work at every single station on the manufacturing line. So the way that they affect product quality might be relatively narrow in scope, in the same way that we wouldn't expect an operator to have proficiency in supply chain or various quality elements. So you do get to define the areas and the ways in which an individual in the organization affects product quality. And that comes in place in subsection A. So we look at 6.2.A, and that is where we determine the necessary competence for personnel performing work that affects product quality. And the primary way that we do that, usually as an organization, is through the job description. And that's one of the reasons why within the quality side of the organization, we are so particular that Human Resources has job descriptions on file for every role within the organization, because it's the clearest way that we can define within the context of an audit the ways in which a particular individual can have an impact or can affect product quality. Now, if I go back to my previous example around operators, we don't typically have a different job description for every workstation on a manufacturing line, right? So we may only have one broad-based job description that just defines operator, right? Or technician, whatever they're called in your facility. And if that's the case, then you may want to give some consideration to how you further narrow that scope and ensure that operators are only performing jobs which they are competent to perform. There are different ways that you can do that. I'll give you a couple of different examples. There might be some manufacturing lines where you have workstations that are incredibly technical and specific. They require the use of very specialized equipment. So I know that some facilities we have laser welding pieces of equipment, or maybe you have a manufacturing process that is where you're working with very small components, and individuals working on those stations have to have very good hand-eye coordination. Maybe you have individuals that are doing visual inspections, and they're doing visual inspections for cosmetic criteria that includes like the color of different labels and things like that. Each of those different workstations would have different types of requirements that are very specific. So for example, if you have an operator that's performing a visual inspection that has a color component to it, that operator should have a color blindness test on file that shows that they can distinguish the colors that they're supposed to be distinguishing. if you have someone that is performing a laser welding operation, obviously we typically certify individuals to perform tasks on laser welding. Take those as examples of very specific cases, and then I'll kind of go to the other end of the spectrum where we tend to have broad-based competencies and skills, and we'll talk a little bit about some of our injection molding sites. So when you're working with injection molded components, as many of you are aware, there are a set of very common failure modes that we see with injection molded components. And operators in an injection molding facility are typically, pulling parts. If we don't have automated robots that are ejecting parts out of the machine, then operators are pulling parts out of the machine. We might be doing insert molding, so they might be putting parts into the machine before the injection molding process. But a significant amount of the work that they're doing is visual inspection of those parts. And so we train them on general failure modes like flash, short shots, burns, and things like that, that can be equally applied to any kind of injection molded component. So we don't necessarily have to train them to inspect for flash on every single part. We teach them how to inspect for flash in general, and then they can broad base apply that skill set across all manufacturing steps. The reason I bring up those examples is because you're going to want to look at your manufacturing process and understand, are there workstations that where you could apply broad-based skills, meaning how to apply solvents, how to combine components together, how to do very basic visual inspections like missing components and things like that? Or do you have workstations or manufacturing steps that require very specific pieces of equipment or very specific technical skills, either for assembly or inspection, where you might have to have some evidence of competency that is very specific to those workstations or pieces of equipment, things like that? So you have to determine the necessary competence for personnel performing work that affects product quality. That's subsection A. Subsection B is that you're gonna close those gaps if the individual that you've hired to perform that job doesn't have those skill sets. So if we hire an operator and put them at a workstation where they have to use a laser welder, and when we hired them, they did not have those skills already, then we have to close those skill set gaps, teach them how to use that laser welder before we allowed them to build medical devices where they could adversely affect product quality. The next subsection is essentially verifying that the work that we did was successful. We're going to evaluate the effectiveness of the work that we did to train them in the necessary competency for that workstation. And we do that in a couple of different ways. Sometimes if we're evaluating the effectiveness, let's say that we were training on a quality procedure. So we're training a group of quality engineers or quality professionals, or maybe even manufacturing engineers on our CAPA procedure. Then the way we might evaluate the effectiveness of our training and whether those individuals now had the requisite competency in our CAPA system is maybe we give a quiz over the contents of that procedure, or maybe the first time they get assigned to CAPA, they get a buddy that works that CAPA with them, someone who's experienced in the CAPA system, almost like a trainer that over time signs off at the end that they effectively administered the CAPA and they're now trained on the CAPA system. Sometimes in the more technical aspects around the manufacturing process, we might have a system where an operator builds a set number of devices that are then independently reviewed by an inspector or a supervisor. And then at the completion of building a predetermined number of acceptable devices, they become certified on that type of manufacturing process. And then in some circumstances, we actually have operator certification programs that are geared more towards like a CAPA FLICE assessment, where we are doing kind of a gauge R&R in a sense of that operator's capabilities. And so there are a lot of different ways that we evaluate the effectiveness of competency, but you have to do it in such a way that you can document it in their personnel file. I'm gonna go over section D briefly, and then I'm going to skip it and go to section E and circle back around. So section D says that we're going to ensure that personnel are aware of the relevance and the importance of their activities on how they can contribute to the achievement of quality objectives. So we're going to come back to that, because section E, maintain appropriate records of education, training, skills, and experience. This is kind of the training program, right? This is where all of the training records come into play, job descriptions come into play, because effectively what we have to do is we have to show that we have met all of these requirements around human resources, that we determined the necessary competence and we documented that in a job description, that we provided the training, and then we evaluated that our training was effective. And that's usually done through training records, the certifications that I described, or even some more formal operator certification elements. Okay, so those are the records that they're talking about in Section E. I want to circle back around to Subpart D, where we talk about ensuring that personnel are aware of the relevance and importance of their activities and how they contribute to the achievement of quality objectives. So let's talk about that and kind of start with what are the quality objectives, right? So as an organization, the easiest way to define our quality objectives are by our Tier 1 metrics, especially those in the realm of quality. And if you're not already aware, the Tier 1 metrics for quality are the complaint rate, the non-conformance rate, and the number of CAPAs that have exceeded an aging of 180 days up through action implementation. So when you think about the ways that an individual in the organization can affect those Tier 1 metrics, there are a variety of ways. And I don't want to overly focus on the operators, because very clearly the operators have a direct impact in nonconformances and complaints, and in many regards in the CAPAs that we open and close. But any individual within the organization, again, those that fall under this umbrella, and I kind of loosely define it as anybody that interacts with our quality system, should have an understanding of what our Tier 1 objectives are, and should have an understanding of how their role could potentially impact those different areas. A lot of that comes down to building a quality culture within the organization where everybody understands their impact on quality. Probably one of the most difficult things that a site has to do from a quality standpoint is establish that culture. We typically try to do it in programs like see something, say something, or in the ways that we ask anybody in the organization that if they see something that might impact product quality, that we ask them to speak up. But that could equally apply to things that they see that might impact quality system compliance in general. But what we're trying to do as an organization is make sure that there is a connection, that everybody sees the connection between the things that are on their job description and how those things on their job description might have an impact in compliance or product conformity. And I have seen individuals in the organization be asked by an FDA inspector, by an ISO auditor, if they understand that, and to provide examples of how their particular role can impact some of those quality objectives. So if it's not something that you are proactively doing within your site, making sure that individuals understand that element, I would encourage you to kind of revisit that as part of your quality system compliance. That one's tricky. So if you need help on that, feel free to reach out to me, and we can kind of set up some time to talk through how we might implement programs at your specific site that would tackle that particular element of the regulation, because that one's not easy. There's a special note here at the end that talks about the methodology being used to check effectiveness is proportionate to the risk associated with the impact on quality. Essentially, what it means is if this individual's role within the organization has a very high impact and equates to a high risk that if they are not competent in their role, that it could result in significant failures of the device, up to and including catastrophic failure of the device, then the level of the methodology and the level of scrutiny that goes into evaluating their competency should be high. It should be appropriate and equivalent to the level of risk that a poor performance or a lack of competency could result in adverse events for the patient. That is one of the reasons why we are very particular, and you can get audit findings if you have most sites will have some competency measurement that is the equivalent of they read the procedure and they acknowledged that they understood the contents of the procedure, and that is our competency evaluation, right? You can get findings in an audit if the auditor can demonstrate that you have a very high risk manufacturing process, a high risk quality system procedure, And the only way you're evaluating competency is that somebody read and claims that they understood the procedure without any further evaluation of competence. You can get audit findings for that. So you need to, in the same process where you are determining the necessary competence for each process in your manufacturing process and different elements of your quality system, you should also be thinking about the risk associated with that process and how that correlates to the way that we evaluate competency of the people performing that task. Section 6.2 is probably one of the most common sections of the ISO standard where an organization receives audit findings because of the dynamics of all the different pieces here within this clause around competency and training. So if your organization currently has open CAPAs around this or recently had audit findings around this, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a bad training program. It just means that your training program has some areas of opportunity for improvement, and this is just a common area where sites struggle. Any questions about 6.2 before I move on to 6.3? There's a lot there that we just unpacked. Okay. We're going to keep rolling. We're going to go into section 6.3, which is around infrastructure. Again, another element of resources that in the context of management commitment, they commit to providing the requisite infrastructure in order for us to be able to achieve the two objectives around resources, and not to be excessively redundant, but we're trying to implement a quality system and maintain its effectiveness, and we're trying to meet applicable regulatory and customer requirements. And our customers and the regulations do have requirements around infrastructure. So the organization shall, keying in on the shalls of the regulation, the organization will document the requirements for the infrastructure that's needed to achieve conformity to product requirements, which is another way of saying customer requirements, prevent product mix-up, and ensure orderly handling of product. And they break that down into three categories. And the categories that they've got are buildings, workspace and utilities, product equipment, that includes hardware and software, and then supporting services such as transport, communication, and information systems. So I'm going to go through each of those categories and just give some examples of areas within the quality management system where we try to address those elements of infrastructure and why it drives certain behaviors. So when we think about buildings and workspace and the requirement within the standard that the organization will document requirements in order to ensure product conformity, prevent mix-up, and orderly handling of product, one of the areas that I think is particularly applicable to buildings and workspace is preventing product mix-up and handling of product. And when I think of product mix-up, I think primarily of the typical requirement that we have where we try not to have, there are three types of product that we do not want co-located anywhere in the facility. We want non-conforming materials completely segregated from all other types of materials. We want material that has been sterile or sterilized, completely segregated from non-sterile product. So if you're producing finished goods or subassemblies and you have sterile and non-sterile subassemblies of finished goods, you want those physically segregated and not close to each other. And then we typically want raw materials segregated in an area that is controlled as well. So what does that mean in terms of buildings and workspace? Well, it might mean from a workspace standpoint that your non-conforming materials are not only physically segregated, but they have restricted access, right? So that not everybody can get into the non-conforming materials cage, pull materials out of there and use them in manufacturing. It might mean that you require a certain amount of square footage within your facility from a warehousing standpoint so that you can physically segregate sterile finished goods from non-sterile finished goods. And it might mean that you need a certain amount of square footage in order to have the proper workflows to do things like final packaging and things of that nature so that you have that orderly handling of product, right? When we think about packaging activities, we like to see them happen in a single piece flow as opposed to just having stacks of boxes in one location, piles of labels sitting over here and then tons of product, and we're just kind of throwing it all together and putting it on a pallet, right? We want to have enough space and infrastructure and equipment so that we can have an orderly process for the handling of the product. Handling of the product can also mean things like having the appropriate hoods in order to be able to kit jobs ahead of going into the manufacturing floor. It might also mean utilities like having proper electrical hookups so that you have the appropriate amperage or voltage in order to operate large pieces of equipment. You might need compressed air. You might have some, pneumatic equipment that you need to have on the manufacturing floor. So there are a lot of things from a building's workspace and utilities standpoint that affect our ability to have a manufacturing process that meets the requirements of our quality management system, that meets the customer requirements as well. Process equipment is pretty straightforward. We have an infrastructure requirement that we will provide the necessary equipment to achieve the manufacturing process. Process equipment doesn't always mean fancy robots and automated equipment. It can be very simple functional pieces of equipment. And we also have, and when we talk about the requirements for those pieces of equipment, okay, this is an area that is kind of easy to discuss when we're talking about process equipment. We have to document the requirements for that piece of equipment, and then we have to demonstrate that the equipment meets those requirements. So when you think about things like IQ, OQ, PQ, that is the process by which we define the requirements that we need out of this piece of equipment, and then we show that it can perform as expected so that we can meet the customer requirements and so that we can achieve conformity for product requirements as well. That extends to software as well. Now, software is a little bit of a unique case in that there are different rules for software that, again, when we think about resources and we go up to the top of the section and it talks about where it can have an impact on product quality. Frequently, when we think about equipment and software validations, we talk about it in the context of, is this going to impact product quality? Because if a piece of software or a piece of equipment has no impact on product quality, then the requirements for things like equipment qualification and validation are not the same. They don't need the same level of rigor that equipment that will impact product quality has. The supporting services like transportation, communication, and information systems. So transportation, again, we want to make sure that in the transport of materials, we're not mixing sterile and non-sterile product, that we're not damaging the product because the pallets are configured incorrectly, or they're damaged by a forklift, or they're damaged by a truck, or they're damaged by the environmental conditions that they are exposed to during transportation as well. So we have to document what those requirements are. If you've ever seen a work instruction that included the pallet diagram that shows how to stack boxes on a pallet, that is an effort to comply with this section of the regulation. So after that, it talks about in addition to documenting the requirements for the infrastructure, we will also document requirements for the maintenance activities, including the interval of those maintenance activities, to show that we can maintain these pieces of equipment, that we can maintain these buildings and workspaces and the supporting services so that they will continue to perform as we expect them to and continue to allow us to achieve that product conformity. And the requirements shall apply to equipment that's used in production and the control of the work environment and monitoring and measurement. So control of the work environment is something that we're going to talk about in the next section. So what they're trying to outline here is that when we think about the equipment that affects product quality, yes, we're talking about the equipment that is used in production, but we're also talking about the support equipment that creates the work environment in which we do that production or manufacturing process. And obviously, records of the maintenance shall be maintained. When you see us talking in management review or in internal audits, and we're looking at things like, do we have a PM schedule for a piece of equipment? Do we have records of all the preventive maintenance that was done to that piece of equipment? Was the preventive maintenance done on time on that piece of equipment? This is the paragraph in the regulation that we're trying to drill down into to make sure that we can demonstrate compliance with that section of the regulation. Any questions about infrastructure before we move on to work environment and contamination control? Okay. Work environment. Organization shall document the requirements for the work environment. So if you've ever worked on a project where a customer in their customer specifications said that the manufacturing must take place in a Class 8 clean room or in a Class 7 clean room, or maybe it doesn't have to take place in a clean room at all. That is one of the ways that we receive documentation that documents the requirements for the work environment that's needed to achieve conformity to product requirements. And if the work environment can have an adverse effect on product quality, then we have to document those requirements. We have to have procedures to monitor and control the work environment. Now, this can apply to a lot of different things. It can apply to things like flow hoods, but the most common way that we encounter this in terms of the regulation is with our clean room environments. And so we have our customers that define clean room requirements, but then we also have standards that define clean room requirements, and then we have internal procedures that define clean room requirements as well. And if you're not familiar, I'm going to very, very quickly describe why clean room environments impact product conformity. And it happens primarily in two ways. One of them has to do with sterility, and one has to do with cosmetic requirements. So we'll talk about sterility first. The clean room environment helps us establish what I refer to as our baseline bioburden. So when we're going through the validation process of a manufacturing line, we set up the line, and after we validate the line, we take a subset of samples and we send them out for bioburden analysis, and we quantify the amount of bioburden that is on those devices. And that is what I refer to as the baseline bioburden. This is the amount of bioburden that we contribute to the device through the environment that we're manufacturing in, through all of the interactions that that device has with equipment and personnel in that work environment. We have contributed a quantifiable number of bioburden onto that device. And then when we perform our sterilization validation, we demonstrate that the sterilization process and the cycles associated with that are sufficient to a very high statistical probability that it will be able to not only kill the amount of baseline bioburden that we contributed to the device, but supersede that by a large factor, okay? I believe it's like 10 to the 6 or something like that. So the way that our work environment affects product quality is we have to prove that we do not deviate too far from the work environment conditions that existed when we did that sterilization validation, because what we don't want to see is that that baseline bioburden is dramatically increased because our work environment is no longer performing at a high level. Because what it starts to do is it starts to impact your sterilization validation and your ability to state to a very high degree of confidence that the sterilization cycle that device is going to undergo will be successful in producing a sterile device on the other side. Now, you'd have to have a pretty dramatic excursion of some kind in your clean room in order for that to be a concern. But it does happen, and it happens primarily in the area where we measure what's called air and surface viables. So if you've ever been involved in clean room monitoring and you've heard them talking about air and surface viables, that is the routine monitoring that we're going to see here, and the standard is required that we perform to demonstrate ongoing control of the work environment and that contamination control. We're trying to demonstrate that the anticipated bioburden baseline has not drifted too far from where it was when we validated the sterilization validation and the clean room itself. The second area where the work environment can impact product conformity or product requirements is in the area of things we call either foreign matter, particulates, or sometimes it's just referred to as particulate contamination. So most customers will have some level of specification that describes the amount of foreign material that can exist, whether it's on the device, in a packaged tray, in a packaged pouch. And the clean room environment itself is intended, and there are things that we do in terms of the height of workbenches and the PPE that we ask personnel to wear. All of those things are intended to have a positive impact on the amount of particulates or foreign material that are circulating in the room itself on an ongoing basis, and their ability to potentially be introduced to the product, right? If you've ever been in a clean room when the power goes off, the first thing they have everybody do is cover all of the product in the room. That's is essentially intended to try and be as proactive as we can in preventing the particulates that are circulating in the room from settling on the product, and then we're not achieving that product conformity requirement. So those are the two primary ways, or most common ways, that we talk about how the work environment can have an adverse effect on product quality, because it affects the baseline bioburden of the device, or it affects that cosmetic particulate requirement that the customer has. So the organization is going to document requirements for the work environment and the procedures to monitor and control the work environment. So we monitor it through things like monitoring those air and surface viables. We monitor particulates when we do our environmental monitoring. We also monitor things like the positive pressure of the rooms. We monitor temperature and humidity. There are a lot of things that we monitor around the work environment to ensure that it is not having an adverse effect on product quality. So after we have established all of those requirements, then we have to document requirements for health and cleanliness and clothing of personnel, especially if they're going to be coming into contact with the devices, and again, could be contributing to that baseline bioburden. So most of your sites, all of your sites, have a procedure that talks about hygiene. It talks about what PPE you have to wear, your gowning requirements when you go into the clean room. It talks about the fact that if individuals are sick, that they shouldn't be working in the clean room environment. Anything that could have an effect on the medical device safety or performance. And when we talk about medical device safety in this context, a lot of times what we're talking about is sterility, right? Or potential for microbiological contamination. I'm actually really impressed that I said microbiological contamination the first time without screwing it up. So we're also required to ensure that all personnel who are required, even temporarily under special environmental conditions, to be competent or supervised. And what that means is, if we have contractors that are going to be going into the clean room in order to do work on a piece of equipment, or they're going into the clean room to clean the clean room, those individuals have an impact on that work environment. And so they have to be competent and compliant with all the necessary gowning, hygiene, all of those things as they're working in the clean room, even if it's only on a temporary basis. There is a note here at the end of this section that references two ISO standards, ISO 14644 and ISO 14698. You don't need to know the full context of those standards unless you work in those areas, but I'll just tell you briefly. 14644 has multiple parts. It's got 644-1 through, I think there's at least a dozen, if not more, and that details the design of a clean room, the construction of a clean room, how you validate a clean room, how you do the routine environmental monitoring. So everything that describes a clean room environment falls under this work environment clause of the ISO 13445 standard. All of that is defined in the suite of 14644 standards. And then 14698 is the standards around biocontamination control. So again, very much geared towards the control of the work environment and how it affects product quality or product conformity to the customer requirements and to the sterilization validation. Questions about 6.4.1 or clean rooms in general before we move on to contamination control? Okay. As appropriate, the organization shall. We will document arrangements for the control of contamination or potentially contaminated product in order to prevent contamination of the work environment, contamination of personnel, or contamination of product. So in the event that we uncover or detect through our monitoring that we think something has gone wrong with the work environment and there is a potential impact on product, this states that we're required to segregate that product so that it can't affect the environment, it can't affect other product, and it can't affect people. There's also an element to this that if your site receives complaints from the field, so you receive complaints that have a bloodborne pathogen or biological contamination coming into the building, then there is a whole separate set of requirements for how we have to treat that product in order to prevent contamination of work environments, people, and other product as well. And then this section also talks about how for sterile medical devices, the organization documents the requirements for the control of contamination with microorganisms and particulate matter. I talked about how we do that monitoring of viable organisms and particulate sampling, and then maintain the required cleanliness during assembly or packaging process. So we have this environmental monitoring program, and we also certify our clean rooms. And when we certify our clean rooms, they do some of the same testing that we do when we do the routine environmental monitoring. So they'll do the air and surface viable sampling. They'll also do the particulate sampling, but they are also looking at things like the number of air changes in the clean room per hour. They're also looking at the positive pressure to make sure that we have cascading positive pressure. They're looking at a couple of other things, flow rates of air coming out of the HEPA filters. They're looking at much more than what we would look at during our monthly or quarterly environmental monitoring, depending on how frequently your site does it. Okay, so that is resources. Again, going back to the beginning and kind of revisiting where we started. When the management commits to having a quality management system, maintaining its effectiveness so that we can meet customer requirements and regulatory requirements, the way they do that is providing resources. They provide human resources, they provide infrastructure resources, and they provide work environment and contamination control resources. And in each one of those sections, we have to define the requirements of the resources that we need. We have to demonstrate competency of those resources, whether they are human resources, whether they are equipment resources, infrastructure resources. We have to demonstrate that they're competent and effective. We have to show how we measured competency. We have to have records that demonstrate all of those things. And then we have to maintain it over time. So how do we maintain it over time for people? We do it through ongoing training, making sure that they understand how they impact the quality objectives. For equipment, we do it through a preventive maintenance program. For work environment, we do it through environmental monitoring and clean room certification primarily. Again, like I said, in terms of the length of this section of the regulation, it's relatively short. It's one of the shorter sections of the regulation, but that does not in any way have indication on the complexity of what it is asking us to do from a compliance standpoint. This is a very involved section when you think about the amount of activity and the amount of work and effort that goes into the maintenance of this section of the regulation from a quality system standpoint. Any questions about any of that that I can answer? That is the information that I had prepared to deliver today, but I'm happy to answer questions, or if you don't have any questions, you're free to go. I appreciate everybody's time. This is recorded, so you can revisit it. I'll hang back for a few minutes in case folks want to stick around and ask questions, but thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank
Absolutely.
you. Thank you.